Hey, yeah, good afternoon. Probably Monday sometime. I guess you guys are on spring break. It's now, I guess we're in week 9 of the course. I know you guys are on spring break, and so I've got a bit of what we'll do with the readings coming up. I guess first of all, let's start with the fact that, as always, folks, the core group of folks who've been participating in the class and working really well in the discussion post, I think we've done some really good work there. So kind of where we'll go sort of at this point in the class, we're about halfway through. And, personally, I really like what we've been able to sort of generate in terms of the discussion. We may start switching it up a little bit from week to week. We'll sort of keep working with the discussion posts. Just kind of pay attention to the discussions. The instructions for them. I know that I've made them all available to you every week going forward, because essentially I didn't think it's going to change, but they may change slightly from week to week because we're getting towards the end of reading Almanac of the Dead. And I know that you guys are on spring break right now, so this week. So what I would like to do is we should have read up to about page 665 for this week. If you're not that far along in the book, that's fine. But over the next, through week 9 and week 10, we need to finish reading the book. So essentially over the next 2 weeks, we should have completed reading Almanac of the Dead. What I'll do is sort of not in this next week. Just go ahead. The discussion for this next week will kind of go ahead and just go upon what we've been doing previously, which is just to have you just keep finding articles and keep coming up with different things that are going on in Indian country. I mean, but I would stress to you probably at this point is if you can, is begin to reach into, start discovering Indigenous communities have been engaging with social media like every other communities across the globe. As social media expands, the ability to have voices heard, to expand conversations beyond Indian country and begin developing dialogues amongst Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities has been going on. In the same way, the impact of social media communication and the ability and the flattening out of reporting and journalistic enterprises to sort of get the news out from Indian country, with the ever increase of technology and putting the ability for people to sort of tell their own story into their hands is deeply engaging. And I think Almanac of the Dead towards the end begins to point towards keep in mind this book was written well before the internet developed. But there seems to be within the novel, and I would say certainly more so within Indian country, this sort of ever expanding out means of communication because communicating and the ability to report and the ability to tell one's own stories has become hyper democratized, hyper individualized. And at the same time, I think we see Indian communities building sort of a sense of tribalism to that sort of hyper-individualized form of democratized form of communication that we use within within our cell phones. I thought I had mine, but I'm shooting the video on it. Keep in mind that. And I say all this because what I want you to do is to perhaps begin to look for those spaces where Indians are communicating for themselves in social media. So look for places like News from Indian Country Today. Look for tribal newspapers, right? Especially within the United States. Look for those spaces where indigenous folks are telling their own story, right? We've been pulling in an awful lot of sources from outside Indian country. I would stress, I would like to see what would happen if folks began to sort of dig within those conversations that are happening within Indian country and in terms of discussion. So, and let's see what we come up with in the next few weeks. There's another concept that I would like us to think about too, and it's sort of, I've begun thinking about it as I was reading for this week's readings. How do we approach a text and how do we analyze the text? A very simple way, I think, or a very interesting way, I think, to always sort of approach the reading of a piece of literature is to, as you read the text, begin to, when we read, we tend to see particular concepts, right, begin to centralize, and there seems to be this common denominator of a concept that'll run across a story, right? And I'll give you an example of one here in just a minute. And so if you take this idea of this one central concept and then begin to try to define it, and by define it I mean what the concept is, how you define it, how the book might define it, and how other places, other spaces besides just you and the world of the book, how else it might be defined just in terms of the word. And also how that word or that concept and its definition may change over time. Say hello, RT. This is RT. He's my good boy. So also how that concept may change over the life of the novel, or also may change over the course of historic time. And let's look, if we look at this week's readings, right? I want to start with, it's on page, I want to say it's on page like 569 of my text. It's at the beginning of the reading for this week, book one called The Foes. It's from the Ancient Almanac. And it's, I'm going to read for about a page here, and then I'll talk about it, and then we'll talk about how week 10's discussion will go. Let you could read the old notebooks and scraps of newspapers, clippings for hours and forget all about the pain. The first time Leitcha opened the notebook, she had recognized here was the real thing. Despite all of Yoemi's lying and boasting, the almanac was truly a great legacy. Yoemi and others believed the almanac had living power within it, power that would bring all the tribal people of the Americas together to retake the land. For hundreds of years, guardians of the almanac notebooks had made clumsy attempts to repair torn pages. Some sections had been splashed with wine, others with water or blood. Only fragments of the original pages remained. Carefully placed between the blank pages, those of ancient paper had yellowed, but the red and black painted glyphs had still been clear. The outline of the giant plumed serpent could be made out in pale blue on the largest fragment. The pages of ancient paper had been found between the pages of horse-cut parchment carried by the fugitive Indian slaves who had fled north to escape European slavery. Leitcha speculated that some keepers of the old almanac had been illiterate, but had not bothered to hire someone to read the pages for them. If they had any curiosity about the writing, then their fear, which was greater, had prevailed. What they had feared were the spirits described in the writing and the glyphs on the pages. There was evidence that substantial portions of the original manuscript had been lost or condensed into odd narratives which operated like codes. The great deal of what had accumulated with the almanac fragments had been the debris gathered here and there by the aged keepers of the almanac after they had gone crazy. A few of the keepers had fallen victim to delusions of various sorts. Here and there were scribbles and scratches, and Leitcha found pages where old Yoemi had scribbled arguments and margins with the remarks and vulgar humor Leitcha and Zeta had enjoyed so many times with their grandmother. Whole sections had been stolen. And then let's look at this one part. Europeans called it coincidence, but the almanacs had prophesied the appearance of Cortez to the day. All Native American tribes had similar prophecies about the appearance, conflict with, and eventual disappearance of things European. The almanacs had warned the people hundreds of years before the Europeans arrived. The people living in large towns were told to scatter, to disperse, to make the murderous work of the invaders more difficult. Without the almanacs, the people would not be able to recognize the days and months yet to come, days and months that would see the people retake the land. Yoemi alleged the Aztecs ignored the prophecies and warnings about the approach of the Europeans because Montezuma and his allies had been sorcerers who had called or even invented the European invaders with their sorcery. I'll read that again. Yoemi alleged that the Aztecs ignored the prophecies and warnings about the approach of the Europeans because Montezuma and his allies had been sorcerers who had called or even invented the European invaders with their sorcery. Those who worshipped destruction and blood secretly knew one another. Hundreds of years earlier, the people who hated sorcery and bloodshed had fled north to escape the cataclysm prophesied when the blood worshippers of Europe met the blood worshippers of the Americas. Montezuma and Cortez had been meant for one another. Yoemi always said sorcery had been the undoing of people here and everywhere in the world. Sorcery had been the undoing of people here and everywhere in the world. this idea of sorcery comes up here in the beginning of this text, at the beginning of our reading for week 9 or week 8, and it carries on through most of the text, right? This idea of sorcery. So if you were to think about this text, you could start with this idea of sorcery or witchery, even to the point to where it, in terms of who to blame here, right? This concept of sort of sorcery as though Montezuma had called forth the blood worshippers from Spain, right? Blood worshippers, obviously. What is this idea of sorcery? How do we view sorcery in a negative or a positive sense? If we view it as a negative sense, right, as an anti-Christian element, right, and it has this bloodthirst of Europeans, and then the text goes on to sort of lay out this idea of sort of, right, there's a certain sense of bloodthirst in Christianity, right? We could also think of how this idea of bloodthirst sort of plays out and how sorcery sort of fits into that, right? And so then we could also begin to go back, and if we this concept of this is introduced of sorcery here on page 569. What if we backed up into the text now and thought, how should I read all of these other sort of acts of sort of violence in the text, right? As sort of driven by sorcery in some sense, right? There seems to be this great sort of otherworldliness that's operating just outside this text that's having this profound sort of spiritual impact. The entire world is corrupt within the novel, right? The entire world seems completely delusional and destroyed, right? And yet there's still characters behaving morally within that world, right? So what role does sorcery play, right? How would you define sorcery, and how would that word change, and how might its meanings change across the different groups that are sort of here in the text? Okay, I'll leave you with that. For this week, for week 9, go ahead and just post an article, but I would strongly encourage you to begin to look for those sources that are sort of media sources that are derived from Indian country. We'll need to finish reading of this book between now and the end of week 10. In week 10, I'm going to ask you to sort of begin to pick a concept and maybe discuss that concept across the world of the novel. In week 11 of the course, we'll have a couple of films that we'll watch. We'll watch a film called Frozen River, and we'll also watch a film called The Golden Dream. 2 instances of sort of films set in and around borders, one on the southern border of the United States and the other on the northern border of the United States. Let's think about, that'll be in week 11, and then towards the end of the class, and then for the last 5 weeks of the class, we'll be reading Grace's Potiki, and we'll also be watching a couple of films there towards the end, right? So, you know, if you're caught up in the class and you're going, well, right, you know, we're halfway there. You know, I promise you we'll finish reading Almanac of the Dead in the next couple of weeks. And then we'll sort of move towards across the Pacific Ocean. All right, that's all I have. Any questions, be sure to email me. Same discussion for this week with a focus on trying to find news from Indian country. Also, week 10, start thinking about a concept, and I'll put all this in the instructions. Finish the book by the end of week 10. Any questions at all, reach out, let me know. All right, thanks so much. Yeah, bye.